the point that I have made, and I've made this across NATO, I've made this internationally, is that we have got to stick with Ukraine in their self-defense. We've also got to recognise the huge economic pressure that's being placed on a number of countries around the world, not just in Europe actually, including the developing world, which is why it's really, really important that we get this war successfully concluded as quickly as possible. So look, there will be frustrations that we hear internationally with the pressure that countries are feeling, but as I say, from my point of view, we've absolutely got to stick with it.
You've got a hugely important role as Foreign Secretary. Let's start with a couple of big international stories today. Really interesting elections in Slovakia, and why people are watching that is the person that's been elected there has said quite openly they want to restrict help for Ukraine and support for Ukraine. Does this worry you? Is this the first sign of a crack in the NATO alliance in terms of Ukrainian support?
Well, one of the things that we have to recognise is that the war in Ukraine, which the Ukrainians didn't ask for, they didn't invite, is putting huge pressure on all of us. We've seen in the UK inflation that's been driven by food and fuel shortages that have been triggered by the conflict in Ukraine. And many of the countries closer to the conflict physically than us are feeling the most pressure. Now, the point that I have made, and I've made this across NATO, I've made this internationally, is that we have got to stick with Ukraine in their self-defense. We've also got to recognise the huge economic pressure that's being placed on a number of countries around the world, not just in Europe actually, including the developing world, which is why it's really, really important that we get this war successfully concluded as quickly as possible. So look, there will be frustrations that we hear internationally with the pressure that countries are feeling, but as I say, from my point of view, we've absolutely got to stick with it.
And of course, we've also seen some kind of tensions in America as well, particularly with Republicans saying, look, we've got to, think of America first. We've got to be careful about the money that we're spending in Ukraine. Does that trouble you?
Well, I've had this...
Because there could be a change of president.
Well, I've had this conversation in America with people from right across the political spectrum, including from Republicans. And the point that I make is that actually America is spending, in absolute terms, significant amount of money, but in terms of, as a percentage of their defence spending, a very small amount of money supporting Ukraine. And the world would become a more dangerous, more unpredictable, more expensive place if we allow Ukraine to be unsuccessful. Because the message that will be taken by potential dictators all over the world is that the West has only got 18, 24 months worth of staying power, and that is not the message you want to send. So again, I've reinforced the point, we've got to stick with it because it's in our national interest and the US national interest to do so.
Now, you just mentioned in your role as Foreign Secretary, you're travelling around the world. You're very much the big ambassador for the United Kingdom. You're meeting with dignitaries from across the globe at the UN and all over the place. Isn't it difficult for you when you're trying to do your job when you have a Home Secretary who is making very inflammatory comments about race, who's making very inflammatory comments about the rule of law, threatening to leave the European Convention on Human Rights? How does that go down for you when you're doing your job as Foreign Secretary?
Well, internationally, I think the world recognises that we are one of the foundation stone nations in many of the international organisations which have helped us stay relatively safe since the end of the Second World War. We're a P5 member of the UN Security Council, part of the G7. We were one of the countries that founded the ECHR, for example, under Churchill. So they know how much we value these international agreements and institutions. But
it doesn't sound like our Home Secretary feels that she values these institutions.
But I gave a speech to Chatham House, the think tank, earlier this year, and I said that if you want to preserve these things, you have to reform these things. Many of these things were drafted, these organisations, these treaties were drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War. They are now 3/4 of a century old in some instances, and the world has changed beyond recognition.
Sure, but there's reforming, and then there's saying, you know what, we're walking away.
Yeah, but no one, and the Home Secretary has not said that we're going to walk away from these things.
She said
has
you'll
talked
do
about
whatever it takes.
Well, look, we are absolutely committed to breaking the business model of these evil people traffickers, and I think the point that she was making is the people who originally draft these treaties didn't envisage the industrial scale abuse of these agreements, and so we have to make them work. We have to make them work for the 21st century. We have to break the business model of these evil people smugglers,
so
and you've got to reform to
So you're
preserve.
saying reform, but not walk away from?
So we have got to look at making these institutions and agreements work. That's been my position. I gave a whole speech on this earlier on this year.
Just before we leave the Home Secretary, how did you feel about her comments on multiculturalism, saying that had failed in modern Britain? How did you feel about that?
Well, look, I think one of the things that I value massively, and this is on the radio, some people may be able to see the imagery of us, but look, I'm incredibly proud that the UK has the Prime Minister, Home Secretary, the Trade Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, and others are not from...
First Minister of Scotland.
Yes, First Minister of Scotland.
Mayor of London.
Yes, Mayor of London. Scotland's Foreign Secretary.
Yes.
Me. All of whom have families that did not originate from these islands. And I'm incredibly proud of that. And that is really unusual, even amongst other countries that have had many, many decades or even centuries of immigration. Why? Because the UK, I think, has been incredibly successful at integration of migrant communities. And I fear that where people sometimes talk about multiculturalism, what they are talking about is fragmentation and not integrating.
But you don't think you don't think Britain's like a failed state when it comes to multiculturalism?
Well, look, I think the fact that Suella is in the role that she's in, the Prime Minister's in the role that he's in, I and others are in these roles, show that we, as I say, almost uniquely in the world, have been brilliant at integrating people who have come to this country. And I think the really important point is that we continue to integrate, and we do not allow this fragmentation. And I do sometimes worry that when people say multiculturalism, what they're talking about is that fragmentation rather than coming together.
Now, let's move on to some big issues which are dominating the political agenda as we are here in Manchester. One of the straplines of this conference is taking these difficult long-term decisions for the future. What's going to happen with HS2?
Well, look, with a huge multi-decade-long, multi-billion-pound project with HS2, we've got to make sure we are always doing the right thing with regard to making sure the finances are right, making sure that we are tight with regard to the finances, making sure it actually delivers for people. There are spades in the ground, and it will be transformational. And I know I've been asked lots of questions about, can we give guarantees about the routing to Manchester, and the right person the right people to speak about that will be the Prime Minister, the Transport Secretary, as and when we make decisions on this. And we have to make decisions right the way through the process.
Why don't you guys just be honest and say, look, it's got really expensive. The finances are really difficult right now. We just don't know. We're going to have to look at the finances. Instead of doing this dance of the seven veils that we're seeing from everybody, and this has been going on for a week now, why don't just be straight with the British public?
So funnily enough, and I get this desire for kind of simple binary answers on this, but this is a large, complicated project. We are absolutely committed to transport infrastructure in the north. In fact, since 2010, we've spent £33 billion on transport infrastructure in the north of England to really unlock the potential of this part of the country. And we have to make sure that we always are pursuing best value for money, that the delivery is on time and within budget. These are the important decisions that we need to make. But we are absolutely committed to levelling up right across the UK, including the north of England. Okay. Which is why we spent that 33 billion quid on transport infrastructure projects in the here and now, rather than in things that will only be unlocked in a decade's time.
Although people understandably very upset. We'll be speaking to Andy Burnham later on. He's going to be joining me very, very soon.
I'm sure he'll be dispassionate and purely analytical.
In fact, we can see him over there. We're waving to him over there.
Not at all political.
Well, he's got a job to do as well. Listen, I want to also talk to you about the fact that, James, it does feel like there's two conferences going on. There's the conference of the leadership, of which you are a part, in the main conference hall. There's also the other conference going on, which is lots of backbenchers, lots of fringe events, and this real clamour for tax cuts. We've got this big rally tomorrow with Liz Truss. It's sold out, I'm told, her big growth rally, and everybody is chomping at the bit for tax cuts. They want your boss to announce tax cuts. What do you say to them?
So I think it's funny that having policy debates and fringe events is what party conference is meant to be about. Literally, it's about discussing ideas. And of course, when you're in government, there are always going to be at least two events. One event is the government setting out its agenda, and the other event is our fantastic grassroots and backbenchers discussing ideas.
Led by Liz Truss, who's calling for tax cuts.
Look, and the Conservative Party, unlike the Labour Party, instinctively wants to bring down taxes. We instinctively want to make sure that
James, you've got the highest tax take in living memory.
We have also, if you remember, had to recover from a COVID pandemic, which was the single most disruptive economic event in generations, where the Prime Minister, as Chancellor, made really bold and important decisions that kept people in work, people in their homes, food on, which is why
that may well be the case. That is the case. But your backbenchers and activists here, who spoke to one of your activists yesterday, they're raging at how high taxes are. They want you to cut taxes.
And the point that we have made is that is our instinctive position to be a lower tax party. But we also, unlike the Labour Party, recognise that inflation steals money out of the pockets of every single family in the country. So we are committed to bringing down inflation, because whether it's tax cuts or inflation, we are determined to give families more of their own money to spend on their own priorities. In stark contrast to Labour, who inevitably will see inflation go through the roof, inevitably see taxes go through the roof.
You have been in power for 13 years. You've been in power. We've had a Tory Prime Minister.
And our economy's recovered faster than Germany or France.
Taxes. We've got a big state.
Lower than many of our competitors.
We've got highest immigration. Is that what you really wanted after 13 years of a Conservative government?
So the point that I've made is that our economy recovered faster from COVID than France or Germany. It's now back to pre-COVID levels. So we are doing better than the larger European economies. Immigration issues, particularly illegal immigration issues, are worse in continental Europe than they are in the UK. Small boat arrivals are down by 20%. Illegal immigration in Italy is up by 50%.
The electorate is going to
30% across the EU.
What is happening in this country now? I know
what is happening in this country is better than our friends and neighbours around the world.
Yes, but
better than it would be under Labour.
Listen, there's lots of countries that are doing better. Now, listen, I just want to, because I know time
the major
is
economies, France, Germany, their recovery is slower than ours.
There are many other economies that are doing way better than us. That is true.
Well, there's lots of countries in the world, but as I say, the credible comparators are not recovering as quickly as we are.
Now, Rishi Sunak is very much punching back at this conference. He was very punchy this morning on the BBC. But many of the activists here are not that happy. There were leaks WhatsApp messages last night saying that he's got the charisma of a doorknob. Do you think he's got the charisma of a doorknob?
Oh, look, I've seen Rishi on the world stage. I mean, you can see how... so I've seen photographs of him out on the campaign trail. You see how he interacts with people when he meets, as he has done this week. I get to see him on the international stage, and he works through them incredibly effectively on behalf of the British people. There are, I don't know how many. This is one of the biggest conferences ever in terms of attendance. Not everybody is going to be happy with everyone all the time. Never the case.
Do you think?
And also, frankly, if someone's showing your researchers grumpy WhatsApps, that they know that's going to get on your show.
Very,
but it doesn't,
very,
doesn't
very,
reflect
very
the
quickly.
mood
Do you
of
wish
the
Boris
audience.
Johnson was here to G up the troops?
Well, look, Boris Johnson was a very effective Prime Minister, but the point is he is no longer an MP. The person that will G up the troops is the Prime Minister, and I've no doubt he will do.
Very quickly, you came up in our poll last night that we did as somebody that people would like to see lead the Conservative Party if there was a future contest. Any thoughts on that?
So my job is to be the best Foreign Secretary there's ever been and support Prime Minister to continue to deliver for the British people.
On message, right towards it. James, thank you so much for taking the
mate.
time to speak to Times Radio.
Thank you.
That was the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, joining us on Times Radio.